All right, so before we get started, does anybody have any questions about the response paper Friday or about anything that is forthcoming?
I didn't think our first response paper wasn't due till next Friday.
What does it say on the syllabus?
I think it's this Friday.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I said it for this Friday.
I must have written it down.
Brentwood.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is going to be the 29th at midnight. Right. So you can write on either the elegy, like you can write on one of the elegies. You can try to pick apart one of the riddles, or you can write on the first half of Beowulf. Right. So any of those things are fair game. And I will look at anything that you want to show me before you turn it in, as long as I get it by Thursday. Okay. So I think we talked a little bit about Beowulf last time to try to gauge your level of familiarity with it. So remind me, have either of you actually read Beowulf before?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, so you both have some familiarity with the poem. Okay, so what do you already know about it? What do you already know about Beowulf?
First, sort of Anglo-Saxon, not just Anglo-Saxon, but
Mm-hmm.
first that area of the world's literature, more or less.
Okay, yeah, it's probably, it's not the oldest Anglo-Saxon poem we have, but it's the longest, right? Yeah, this is the longest extant Anglo-Saxon poem. What else do you know about it?
It blends Christian names and pagan names.
Yeah, it's got that same kind of awkward juxtaposition of Christianity and paganism that we saw in the elegies, right? Yeah, good. In fact, we see places in Beowulf where God seems to just be a substitute for the idea of weird or fate, right? Good. What else do you know about it?
It probably goes along with pagan values, but a lot of the values shown in Beowulf, like a person doing their best to face life as a challenge,
Mm-hmm.
Regardless of fate. You're living your life as a challenge and hopefully pushing forward fate.
Yeah. And fate, even when it's here described as the will of God, is inevitable, right? There's no getting around it, there's no getting out of it. If you are that unlucky sap who is doomed to be eaten by Grendel before the rest of your comrades wake up, right? There's nothing you can do about that. It's gonna happen. Anything else?
The digressions.
Yeah, there are these weird digressions in the poem, right, where they reference either history or other myths, right? Now, one thing that we're going to talk about today is that these actually really are important to the structure of the poem, even if they feel kind of like side issues. But yeah, the digressions often, relate to verifiable history or to mythology.
Did you also say, no, never mind, that wouldn't be a digression. When they're in the mead hall after he defeats Grendel and the
Uh-huh.
is telling the story of the dragon and everything.
Oh, that is actually a digression, right?
Okay.
And we're actually going to be reading a slightly later Norse version of that same story when we look at the Volsunga saga later on.
Could we say that digressions also sometimes foreshadow?
Yeah, they often do foreshadow things that are going to happen in the text, right? And even things that are going to happen outside of the text, right? So let's actually point to one of these digressions now. When Beowulf returns to Geatland, if we go to line 2020, when he describes the upcoming marriage of Hrothgar's daughter Frewaru. Right. Sometimes Hrothgar's daughter distributed ale to the older ranks in order on the benches. I heard the company call her Frewaru as she made her rounds, presenting men with a gem-studded bowl, young bride-to-be to the gracious Ingeld in her gold-trimmed attire. The friend of the Shieldings favors her betrothal. The guardian of the kingdom sees good in it and hopes this woman will heal old wounds and grievous feuds. So he's got a political marriage planned for his daughter, right? He's going to marry her to the prince of the Heathobards, this other clan that Hrothgar's Danes have been at war with, right? They've been feuding with this other group, and they're going to try to heal. They're going to try to heal that breach with this political marriage. But generally, the spear is prompt to retaliate when a prince is killed, no matter how admirable the bride may be. Think how the Heathobards will be bound to feel their lord Ingeld and his loyal thanes when he walks in with that woman to the feast. Danes are at the table, being entertained, honored guests in glittering regalia, burnished ringmail that was their host's birthright, looted when the Heathobards could no longer wield their weapons in the shield clash, when they went down with their beloved comrades and forfeited their lives. Then an old spearman will speak while they are drinking, having glimpsed some heirloom that brings alive memories of the massacre. His mood will darken, and heart-stricken, in the stress of his emotion, he will begin to test a young man's temper and stir up trouble, starting like this. Now, my friend, don't you recognize your father's sword, his favorite weapon? The one he wore when he went out in his war mask to face the Danes on that final day? After Weathergeld died and his men were doomed, the Shieldings quickly claimed the field, and now here's a son of one or other of those same killers, coming through our hall, overbearing us, mouthing boasts, and rigged in armor that is by right yours. And so he keeps on, recalling and accusing, working things up with bitter words until one of the lady's retainers lies spattered in blood, split open on his father's account. The killer knows the lie of the land and escapes with his life. Then on both sides, the oath-bound lords will break the peace. A passionate hate will build up in Ingeld, and love for his bride will falter in him as the feud rankles. I therefore suspect the good faith of the Heathobards, the truth of their friendship, and the trustworthiness of their alliance with the Danes. So this seems like a side issue, right? Like it has little to do with anything else that happens in the poem. But it's a reminder of two things, right? The first actually has to do with ancient Germanic social values. Essentially, your duty to avenge fallen kin is greater than your responsibility for keeping a promise or an oath. Right? This duty supersedes the other. So if these two come in conflict with each other, your duty to avenge, the requirement of vengeance, is what's more important.
So, what it's saying is that if Ingeld marries Hrothgar's daughter,
Mhm.
and there's some feud.
Yeah.
It would be more important for Ingil to fight the Danes rather than keeping a promise to his wife.
Yeah, or to her people. Yeah. Yeah. If there are still Heathobards who are unavenged, for whom no compensation has been paid, right? That's another thing to note here. One way that feuds were diffused in ancient Germanic cultures was largely through the payment of what was called weregild or man price. Right, we're going to see this concept particularly applied in the Volsunga saga when we look at the story of Fafnir the dragon and his brothers. So weregild was the compensation you paid to the family of a man that you killed. Now, if you killed him in battle, that was one thing, right? If you killed someone, if you killed someone in self-defense, that was also another thing, right? But if you killed someone in cold blood, the only way to avert a feud or to keep the law off of you was to pay what the family felt that man's life was worth, right? So if you paid the weregild, if you paid the man price, then they forfeited any right to avenge themselves on you. It was a means of keeping the peace in a society that was wrapped by violence, and in which these kinds of kinship ties were very, very close and taken very seriously, right?
Your family likes you.
What's that?
You better hope your family likes you. They might be like, yeah, you know what? No, you don't have to pay anything. He's a crap person anyway. It's fine.
But if the other reason why this digression and others within it are important is also because of that broader Anglo-Saxon worldview that we talked about, right? What is eventually going to happen to Hrothgar's kingdom?
It'll die eventually.
Yeah. Entropy and chaos always win, right? Chaos always comes out on top. Our little forts, these little bastions of order that we build, are always temporary. So even though Beowulf has saved Heorot for another span of time, right, by defeating Grendel and his mother, eventually these other forces, these social forces, are going to come into play to destroy Hrothgar and his kingdom, right? Hrothgar is doomed, but in the way that everyone is doomed, right? And Hrothgar, at least, has left behind sons to succeed him. Although that's actually also a little bit more complicated, so we'll talk about that in a minute too. That's actually another of the more interesting digressions in Beowulf. But I want to steer away from the digressions for now a little bit to the main body of the poem, or at least what Tolkien believed was the main body of the poem. And I'll explain why as we get into the close study that he made of Beowulf, right? So, in 1936, Beowulf was dead, his problems were over. Tolkien was invited to give the prestigious Sir Israel Galanch Memorial Lecture on topics in literature and language. And he gave a talk that was entitled Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics, which is one of the single most influential studies of Anglo-Saxon literature done in the 20th century. Now, people question a lot of Tolkien's arguments and conclusions now, but in 1936 he was saying something about this poem that was radically new. So, he started by looking at the kinds of arguments that his contemporaries and predecessors had been making about Beowulf. Essentially, that as a poem, it wasn't much good, and it wasn't really worth studying as a work of art, right? That what it was valuable for were the things that we could learn about Anglo-Saxon language from it, and these little digressions that could help to confirm the historical existence of certain figures who appeared in other poems, right? That these digressions are typically related to real history. And a lot of the early critics of Beowulf saw it as a fault in the poem that stories like, the tale of Freyawaru and Ingeld, or the story of Hildebert, Finn, and Hengist, which referred back, or the story of Queen Modthryth, which referred back to actual history. That these were the more important things in the poem, and the poet treats them as though they're secondary, right? That these digressions, had he developed a poem on these themes, would have been better, right? Instead, these critics argued, what we're left with is this very juvenile fairy tale construction in which a mighty hero fights monsters. So people who studied Beowulf were embarrassed by the monsters, basically, right? Now, what Tolkien argued ran directly counter to what other critics in the day were saying. So first off, he argued for the centrality of the monsters to the poem, right? No, there's a reason why the monsters are at the middle of this, right? And it's not a flaw, it's not a fault. Rather, it's part of the overall design. And the overall design that he sees is a kind of parallel design in which the first half of the poem focuses on the youth and so the maturing and growth process of the hero. And the second half of the poem focuses on his old age and his death, right? So we see the hero in the morning and at night, the hero in spring and in winter. He also regarded it as an exquisite meditation on the inevitability of death and defeat. We'll focus more on this part of it next time when we read the end of the poem. But these are the arguments that Tolkien makes in his essay, or in the lecture that he gave. And it's really this lecture that gets people to look at this poem, which again, is the biggest single coherent Anglo-Saxon text we have, not as clumsy hack work, but as part of a unified artistic object, right? That operates according to its own particular logic and principles. So let's take a closer look at the hero himself, at Beowulf himself, at least in his youth as we see him here. Now, what do we note about Beowulf himself? What characteristics or qualities does Beowulf himself display?
He's brave.
Okay.
Super brave.
Yep.
I think he's a little humble.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's humble when he has to be and boastful when he has to be, right? There's nothing wrong, like we tend to view pride as a fault or a sin. In most, not just in Germanic, but in most European pagan cultures, pride was perfectly all right and acceptable if you could back it up. Right? Humble when necessary, but he is also proud of his achievements. Right? Because the way, remember, that you achieved immortality was by performing deeds that people remembered. And if you don't boast about your deeds, right, who's going to know that you did them?
The strength of 30 men.
Yeah, he is also immensely strong, right? Yes. We're told he has the strength of 30 men. In fact, what weapon does he use to defeat Grendel?
His own strength.
Yeah, just his own bare hands, right?
I answered that one.
Yeah,
I get to a test and I'm like, can we use this? And I get to a discussion, like, no, he did that. Oh gosh.
But he gets Grendel in an arm lock, right? And rips his right arm and shoulder off. So the name Beowulf translates directly to Beowulf, which means bear. So he is a hero that is given certain qualities associated with the bear, right? In particular, that he is immensely strong and is able to rip his enemies into pieces, right? Bear heroes are actually fairly common in Northern European folklore.
Cuchulain.
Pardon?
Cuchulain.
Cuchulain has similar qualities, right? You know, he is able to transform himself via this thing called the warp spasm, right, into this kind of monstrosity that is then able to tear apart several men. More specifically in Beowulf's case, he seems to be closely related to a hero of Norse sagas called Bolvar Bjarki, whose name literally means little war bear. And Bolvar he's possessed by a bear spirit. And it's suggested in the sagas that he appears in that he is able to either transform himself into a bear or to allow his bear spirit to kind of roam abroad to harass his enemies and the enemies of his lord. Now, he is a companion or servant of a Danish king called Hrolf Kraki, who appears in Beowulf as Hrothulf, Hrothgar's nephew. So there are there's several parallels and connections between Beowulf and this hero, Bolvar Bjarki. And I think it's important for cultural and historical reasons to look at the passage in which Hrothulf is mentioned here. Right, he's specifically mentioned by Hrothgar's queen, Wealhtheow. look around line 1167, right? Starting with the Queen spoke. Enjoy this drink, my most generous lord. Raise up your goblet, entertain the Geats duly and gently, discourse with them, be open-handed, happy, and fond. Relish their company, but recollect as well all the boons that have been bestowed on you. The bright court of Heorot has been cleansed, and now the word is that you want to adopt this warrior as a son. So while you may bask in your fortune, and then bequeath kingdom and nation to your kith and kin before your decease, right? So what does she seem to be worried about in Hrothgar's treatment of Beowulf?
That he's going to give everything to Beowulf and not
Yeah.
to their children.
Exactly, yeah. He's not going to pass his kingdom on to her sons, right? So there's an anxiety here about succession. This is actually something that runs through the whole poem, right? An anxiety about dynasties and about succession. I am certain of Hrothulf, their nephew, right? He is noble and will use the young ones well. He will not let you down. Should you die before him, he will treat our children truly and fairly. He will honor, I am sure, our two sons, repay them in kind when he recollects all the good things we gave him once, the favor and respect he found in his childhood. So remember that Hrothulf, again, is Hrolf Kraki, who becomes king himself. So if Hrothulf ends up becoming king, what do you think is the likelihood that he repays well the trust that Wealhtheow is placing in him here?
I mean, in my opinion, I think he would repay it because it's like, we don't have to make you the next king, but
No, they don't, because he's not next in line,
you're
right?
not next in line, but we've been good to you since
Yeah.
your childhood.
So if she's
remind you to us even further.
if she's reminding him of how good they've been to him, how likely is it that she actually trusts him?
Not much.
And in fact, he will not repay their trust. He'll do away with Hrothgar, so like in these other sagas that are attached to this, but there's a memory of lingering in Beowulf. He does away with Hrothgar's own sons and takes the throne himself. So there is an intimation here in one of these little digressions, right, that Hrothulf is not to be trusted. And I think that, part of the speech is hoping that Beowulf will also remember how good they've been to him and back up her sons in case nephew Hrothulf gets some ideas, right? So these kinship and political ties are really, really complicated here, right? And there is this real worry about the continuation of dynasties. And this is going to be something really important to remember for the end of the poem, as we see Beowulf meet his end. But I think it's also, we're talking about endings here now. Did you find anything weird about the way the poem begins?
I will say I do like this translation a whole lot better than the one in the Northern Anthology. This one's a lot easier to understand. So it did.
Mm-hmm. I guess they're not using the Heaney translation in the Northern Anthology anymore, huh?
It goes so,
Yep.
and then it goes, spear days, the days gone by.
Yep.
It's like, so.
Yeah. Which is Heaney is using an Irishism in this case. He is himself, or was himself, from Northern Ireland. And so, usually people translate that first word, quit, as hark, or listen, or pay attention. But he makes it the simpler Irish so, which is usually what you say to someone when you just want them to listen to you. What else about the story that we're given here at the beginning, right? Beowulf doesn't show up for several hundred lines, right? And it's even once he does show up, quite some time before he's even named. So what does the beginning of the poem focus on?
Hrothgar.
Succession.
In succession.
Yeah, the succession among the Danes, right? We start with this guy, Shield Sheafson. Right? A foundling to start with, he would flourish later on as his powers waxed and his worth was proved. In the end, each clan on the outlying coasts beyond the whale road had to yield to him and begin to pay tribute. That was one good king. So, one important feature of the poem that I think Keeney actually gets right is that Anglo-Saxon as a language is full of ironic understatement. That was one good king being an example of that. Yeah, we start with this guy, Shield Sheafson, who begins the work of nation building, right? Right, through conquest and/or political maneuvering, he gets control of the various local tribes, right, to build a larger kin group. Afterwards, a boy child was born to Shield, a cub in the yard, a comfort sent by God to that nation. He knew what they had told, the long times and troubles they'd come through without a leader. So the Lord of life, the glorious Almighty, made this man renowned. Now, what does this suggest about what things were like for the Danes before Shield came along?
Chaotic.
Yeah. So he has created some semblance of order in what was a place of chaos, right? And now, by fathering a son and creating a dynasty, he is reinforcing that order, right? So Shield begets Beow. Beow's name was known through the north. And then around line 25, right, Shield dies. And we get a funeral. It's weird to have a funeral so close to the beginning of a heroic poem, right? But the reason I want you to pay attention to this is because of this parallel design in the poem, right? In a way, this is a poem that begins and ends with a funeral. We get Shield's funeral in the beginning. We'll have Beowulf's funeral at the end. And it might be worthwhile to compare the two, right? If we look at the way Shield's funeral proceeds here, right? Shield was still thriving when his time came, and he crossed over into the Lord's keeping. His warrior band did what he bade them when he laid down the law among the Danes. They shouldered him out to the sea's flood, the chief they revered who had long ruled them. A ring-whirled prow rode in the harbor, ice-clad, outbound, a craft for a prince. They stretched their beloved lord in his boat, laid out by the mast, amidships, the great ring-giver. Far-fetched treasures were piled upon him, and precious gear. I never heard before of a ship so well furbished with battle tackle, bladed weapons, and coats of mail. The massed treasure was loaded on top of him. It would travel far out into the ocean's sway. They decked his body no less bountifully with offerings than those first ones did, who cast him away when he was a child and launched him alone out over the waves. And they set a gold standard up high above his head and let him drift to wind and tide, bewailing him and mourning their loss. No man can tell, no wise man in hall or weathered veteran knows for certain who salvaged that load. So, what does the nature of Shield's funeral suggest about his origins? What are we told about where he came from?
He probably started out very poorly, very lowly, and even tamed his realm. They decked his body no less bountifully with offerings than those first ones did, who cast him away when he was a child. So
Yeah, he was apparently just like washed up on the shore as a child, right? And this foundling then came to rule the Danes and to begin this dynasty. So he's being tossed back out to sea as he came from the sea to rule them, right?
But
Go ahead.
the way they decorated his
Yeah.
boat.
Uh-huh.
It signifies that not only did, they respect him as a leader, they
Mhm.
loved him.
Yeah.
And spoiler alert, compared to Beowulf, not so much. They're like, get rid of him, we're done.
Well, there's probably, there's just as much bewailing when Beowulf dies as there is when Shieldus. But yeah, the nature of his funeral is quite different, right? We'll find as we get to the end of the poem, I mean, no spoiler here because you already have read it, right? That Beowulf is burned on a pyre rather than sent out to sea. So, there's...
They wanted to make sure he was dead.
Well, but again, if we're talking about like this parallel design of the poem and this anxiety over dynasties, right? One thing that we probably remember about Beowulf from past readings of the poem, right, is that he doesn't leave behind a dynasty, right? He leaves behind no son, no children. So when he's gone, his people, the Geats, are shit out of luck. Right? There's no protector anymore. There is no, loaf guardian. There is no ring giver, right? So, the wailing the old woman does at the end of the poem, is wailing not just for the past, but also for the future, right? What's going to happen to us? Especially given the way these digressions keep projecting these dire futures outward for all of these clans involved, right? I think it might help too if we spell out like some of the different social groups involved here, and some of the different warring clans. So Scandinavian culture, and we're talking here about events in 6th century Scandinavia, right? It's an English poem, but like in terms of content, the poem has nothing to do with England, right? You have various groups that live in what is now Denmark. Right? You've got Hrothgar's Danes. The Heathobards are mentioned. And in the story of Hildebert, Finn, and Hengist, the Jutes. You've also got people from what are now the Low Countries, right? The Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, the Frisians, and the Franks, who Beowulf's uncle Hygelac will die fighting. And the remainder of the groups that we're looking at here are based in Sweden. Beowulf's own Geats come from southern Sweden, or what is now southern Sweden. And there are also simply the Swedes, who are the traditional rivals and enemies of the Geats. So you have all of these groups that are, some are allied to each other. The Geats and the Danes, right, are allied. We know this because this is the reason Beowulf goes to help Hrothgar in the first place, right? Because Hrothgar had done a good turn for Beowulf's father, so he is repaying that kindness by going to help Hrothgar in his time of need. The Danes and the Heathobards are enemies, right? The Heathobards will eventually destroy the Danes. We have this complicated web of social alliances and enmities. And then within all of that, we also have monsters, right? And again, remember that Tolkien argued that the monsters really are, the struggle against the monsters really is the meat of the poem. And that all of this other stuff that we've been talking about, these dynasties, and the story of Freywild and Ingeld, and Hrothulf and all this other shit, this is actually the stuff that is really kind of in the margins of the poem and ought to be. because it doesn't have any direct, like, all of, like, what it does do is point back to the importance of the monsters and why the monsters matter. So let's look at the two monsters that we have met already by this point in the poem. Who is our primary antagonist?
Grendel.
Yes, one Grendel. And what do we know about Grendel?
He's Spawn of King.
On the pain,
Yeah.
God, hates the hearts.
Yeah, so there are a couple of weird things going on here with the way Grendel is introduced to us, right? On the one hand, yeah, he is written into this kind of extra biblical history, right? This kind of corpus of legend around biblical material that's not actually part of Scripture proper, by being described as the spawn of Cain. So on the one hand, it's a Christianized explanation for belief in things like elves and trolls and hags and ogres, right? So right, it's a Christianized explanation for the existence of monsters. But if Grendel is the spawn of Cain, what does that also mean that he is?
Or human.
Yeah. He is, as Tolkien's friend C.S. Lewis would have put it, still a son of Adam, right?
I was going to say, that puts him in direct line, doesn't it?
Yeah. And his mother is a daughter of Eve, right? So while Grendel may be monstrous and may be warped, he still comes from this human lineage. Yeah, all of these creatures, all of these monsters then are at least partly human or closely related to modern humans. Sort of, I don't know if either of you have ever been to DC, to the Smithsonian Museums. There is, in the Natural History Museum, the Hall of Human Origins, it shows how like there were all of these kind of parallel proto-human species. Right now, we are descended from one of those branches, right? The others all died off. I don't know, like this is actually like kind of relevant to what we're doing in the class. There was this discovery in Indonesia of these small hominid skeletons. The scientific name they gave them was Homo floresiensis, but in the press they were referred to as hobbits.
I think I remember seeing that.
Yeah, and of course, yeah, there are no hobbits, right? Like, you know, the creative origins of hobbits are rural English people, right? But because they're small hominids, right? They're just one of these other branches of the human family tree that didn't survive, right? I just thought that's a kind of interesting digression here. And I don't know that this has anything directly to do with the spawn of Cain idea, right? But it's still, we're looking at like a parallel human family tree, right? Now I want you also to look with me at the description of Grendel, starting around line 85, and think about whether it looks like anything that's familiar to us, right? Or if its situation looks familiar to us in any way. Then a powerful demon, a prowler through the dark, nursed a hard grievance. It harrowed him to hear the din of the loud banquet every day in the hall, the harp being struck, and the clear song of a skilled poet telling with mastery of man's beginnings, how the Almighty had made the earth a gleaming plain girdled with waters. In his splendor he set the sun and moon to be earth's lamplight, lanterns for men, and filled the broad lap of the world with branches and leaves, and quickened life in every other thing that moved. So times were pleasant for the people there, until finally one, a fiend out of hell, began to work his evil in the world. Grendel was the name of this grim demon, haunting the marches, Marauding round the heath and the desolate fens, he had dwelt for a time in misery among the banished monsters, Cain's clan, whom the Creator had outlawed and condemned as outcasts. For the killing of Abel, Cain got no good from committing that murder, because the Almighty made him anathema, and out of the curse of his exile there sprang ogres and elves and evil phantoms, and the giants too, who strove with God time and again until he gave them their reward. If we take out the demon and monster bit, what does Grendel kind of look like?
Exile.
Yeah, he looks like the Rekka, right? The exile figure that we saw in those elegies. The difference here being that Grendel decides to take out his frustrations on Heorot, right? He sees this bastion of civilization, or the end result of the state-building process, the nation-building process begun by Shield Chiefson, set up by his great-grandson, Hrothgar, not Grendel's great-grandson, Shield's great-grandson, and decides that this is something that needs to go, right? We can't have this bastion of order when Grendel himself is left out in the cold, wandering around in the swamps. And, to be fair, right, if you live next to a house where people are constantly partying and feasting, right, it's pretty fucking annoying, yeah? I remember, when I was in my early 20s, I lived for a little while in Queens. My next door neighbors just were constantly partying. They were always having people over all times of night. The music was always blaring, always like people talking, laughing, yelling. And, it made me irritated by the sounds of human joy, the sounds of human mirth. It's like, I got to work in the morning, I just want to go to sleep. And you people won't shut up. So Grendel's frustration from a certain standpoint is understandable, right? Now, if we then look at Grendel's mother, what's interesting about her?
She lives in the mirror.
Yeah, she lives underwater, right? And it's this kind of like, almost kind of like reverse realm, right? You get underwater down to a cave and it's dry. But, yeah, the cave, to get to the cave, you have to swim through all these sea beasts. And then the swimming through the sea beasts mirrors the swimming contest that Beowulf boasts about, right, when he's arguing with Unferth. So yeah, she lives underwater. And let's think as well about Grendel's mother in terms of Germanic cultural values. Does she bother the people of Heorot while Grendel is making his rounds and prowling? When does she start coming after people?
When Grendel's killed.
Yeah. There's, on some level, right, these creatures also follow this same code of behavior that the human beings on land follow, right? That vengeance for slaughtered kin is more important than peace. Although she is also stepping out of what would be regarded as a typical or acceptable feminine cultural role. So one thing that we do know about the Norse, but not about the Anglo-Saxons, is that women actually did fight in Viking armies, right? They sailed on ships. They did fight, in fact, a lot of soldiers and soldiers who went up against the Vikings, who later wrote about their experiences, mentioned how terrifying it was that the women went into battle with the men, right?
They're the only ones that could do math too, because the men thought it was magic.
Yes, and magic was regarded as womanish.
Womanish sailor.
Yeah, yep. Mm-hmm.
I'm telling you, I'm a history nerd, and we're talking about my favorite part.
No, that's good. That's less background work I have to do. The more you guys already know and understand, yeah. So we can compare Grendel's mother to other models of femininity and feminine behavior in the text to see sort of like what is regarded as within bounds for an Anglo-Saxon woman, right? So one thing that we've already noted, if you look at someone like Freyawaru, right? What is an Anglo-Saxon woman's purpose, particularly if she's an aristocrat?
In Weotheo's case, it's like she was going around the table. Her only real job at that moment was going around the table, blessing the food. What was she doing?
She was providing drink.
Yeah.
She pours out drink for everyone, right? So she helps to share out the food and drink. And remember, too, this is actually an important social function of the Lord, right? That the Lord is supposed to keep his men not only wealthy, but fed, right? So the Lord's wife and daughter are helpful in this particular way, right? And we also make speeches. And these speeches often seem to be designed to keep the peace, right? So, for example, the speech that she makes pointing out that, husband, you are showing an awful lot of favor to this foreign warrior. Can we please pay more attention to our own sons? And pointing out her nephew, pointing out kind of in a sideways fashion her nephew Hrolfulf's treachery, right? These would be regarded as important functions of the Lady of the Hall, right? And indeed, given that Freyawaru is about to be married off to cement a diplomatic relationship, right? Women are used as these kind of peacekeeping tokens, right? Freyawaru is going to be married to Ingild in order to end a war or a feud with the Heathobards.
Could you also say that, looking at it from the Anglo-Saxon way, and maybe even like Nordic way, the lady also was a way to display the Lord's power.
Oh, absolutely.
And wealth. Like the better dressed she is, the better jewels she has.
Yeah.
Everything. The easier it is to think, okay, this is a powerful dude. He's
Uh-huh.
got a lot of money. His woman is dressed well. His men are well fed and have treasures.
Yeah. And he's able to deck out his wife in gold, right?
Oh yeah.
I'm trying to find the passage where Rialto first appears, and we're told about what she's wearing. And now, of course, I can't find it because, okay, yeah, right. She's where she's first distributing the drink around the hall, around line 620, right? So the helming woman went on her rounds, queenly and dignified, decked out in rings, offering the goblet to all ranks, treating the household and the assembled troop until it was Beowulf's turn to take it from her hand. So yeah, like the notion that she is decked out in rings She is also helping to display her lord's wealth and status. And there's a reference somewhere too. It's not here. I think it's later on. I think when she's talking about her daughter's potential marriage and other issues with the family, the issues with Hrothulf and whatnot. There's a line that suggests that she herself was married to Hrothgar for political reasons.
And then also comparing Grendel's mother to Webelow, however I'm probably saying it wrong.
Uh-huh.
She's dressed in finery, and when we meet Grendel's mother, she doesn't have any clothes. She's in a birthday suit. Comparing, clothing is, we wear clothes because that's socially accepted. That's a social status. You have clothes, you have nicer clothes, and then her lack of clothes is maybe she's
right. Yeah, lack of interest in social niceties. Lack of civilization. Right.
Yeah.
In fact, in some cases, nudity is meant to kind of display innocence, right? Lack of knowledge of culture, modesty, things like that. But in Grendel's mother's case, it's more that this is a hag who lives underwater.
And she doesn't need clothes to hide weapons. She is a weapon.
She doesn't actually use weapons. Yes. So, there was one more thing that I wanted to. In terms of the roles of women here, and again, like this is all important in part because it is all of this is going to influence the way Tolkien writes women in The Lord of the Rings. You will see that typically. You got a figure like Galadriel, right, who is the most powerful woman in Middle-earth, probably the most powerful mortal being in Middle-earth. But she never leaves Lothlorien, right? She is, number one in her hall, but she still sort of performs a lot of these same functions that we see someone like Wealto performing in Beowulf, right? So if you look around page line 1932, we have the story of Great Queen Modthrith, who perpetrated terrible wrongs. If any retainer ever made bold to look her in the face, if an eye not her lord stared her directly during daylight, the outcome was sealed. He was kept bound in hand-tightened shackles, racked, tortured until doom was pronounced. Death by the sword, slash of blade, blood gush and death qualms in evil display. Even a queen, outstanding in beauty, must not overstep like that. So there's a definite moral lesson coming in here, right? A queen should weave peace, not punish the innocent with loss of life for imagined insults. But Hemming's kinsman put a halt to her ways, and drinkers round the table had another tale. She was less of a bane to people's lives, less cruel-minded, after she was married to the brave Offa, a bride arrayed in her gold finery, given away by a caring father, ferried to her young prince over dim seas. In days to come she would grace the throne and grow famous for her good deeds and conduct of life, her high devotion to the hero king who was the best king, it has been said, between the two seas or anywhere else in the face of the earth. Offa was honored far and wide for his generous ways, his fighting spirit, and his far-seeing defense of his homeland. From him there sprang Eomer, Garmund's grandson, kinsman of Hemming, his warrior's mainstay and master of the field. So we notice how this changes from a story about a woman to a story about a dude, right? And in the time that it's focused on her, it's mostly focused on how she doesn't do the things that a Germanic woman is expected to do, right? That she doesn't behave in an acceptable way. Rather than keeping the peace, she uses her beauty to spur conflict, right? And then, once she is married off to this fellow Offa, by her caring father, right? We have this story of a woman who is kind of tamed then by men. And I think that, there might be an analog here as well in the way Tolkien treats the story of Éowyn. Well, Éowyn is never described as cruel or evil the way Great Queen Mothryth is, right? We've got there, and we'll talk about this a little bit more when we read The Return of the King especially, right? You've got a shield maiden who gets domesticated by Faramir over the course of several conversations in the Houses of Healing, right? And decides that she will ride to battle no more. So I think there are some kind of clear lines of influence here that it's worth tracing. Okay, so since we started early, we're about out of time here. Do you guys have any questions about anything we went over today?
Freywaru is the one who's being married off to Ingild, right?
Yes.
Okay, and
yes.
Ingild is part of the Heathobards, or Heathobard, how do you pronounce it?
Heathobards, yeah.
Okay,
Heathobards,
Heathobards,
yep.
and Freywaru is the daughter of Weothio and Hrothgar.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Freywaru is a Dane. Ingild is a Heathobard. And the Danes and the Heathobards do not like each other.
And that conversation spurred up in Yeatland, or Yeatland.
Yeah. It's Beowulf's prediction of what's going to happen to Hrothgar's home and family, right? That this marriage, which is supposed to bring peace, is going to end up instead destroying everything Hrothgar's built. And there is, the story of Ingild and Freywaru is historically verifiable, right? That this actually was a thing that happened in Denmark in the 6th century. Okay, any other questions?
Yes, trying to figure out, say I wanted to do my response paper on a line from here, how would I do that?
How would you cite it?
Well, not how, because I know we have to put it at the top, so we would just say, let's say I wanted to do, time and again when the goblets passed and seasoned fighters got flushed with beer, they would pledge themselves to protect Heorot and wait for Grendel with whetted swords. Let's say I wanted to do that, would I just do a chunk?
Yeah, you could just do a chunk, or if you don't like the way that looks on the page, you can just type out, when you type out each line at the end, just put a forward slash like that.
Okay.
At the end of each line, just put a forward slash like that. That indicates a line break.
Okay.
And then, just cite the line numbers at the end of the quote.
I was going to do where we first meet Grendel, the son of Cain. I was going to do that line and just pick it apart. Like we did here, he's the spawn of Cain, that's Christianized.
Yeah.
We also understand he's got a human lineage.
Yep. Okay, anything else? All right, we'll see you Monday. I will give you the guide questions. I'll email them to you in a minute when I get back to my office because I'm not organized today. So.